The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Abraham Lincoln by Thomas Dixon, Jr. Thomas Frederick Dixon, Jr., born January 11th, 1864, in Shelby, North Carolina, died April 3rd, 1946, in Raleigh, North Carolina. A well-respected minister, highly educated, a personal friend of President Woodrow Wilson. Wrote the most famous book that he wrote was The Clansman, which was written in 1905 as part of his trilogy of Reconstruction, those being The Leopard Spots, The Clansman, and The Traitor. In 1913, he wrote this book on Abraham Lincoln and dedicated it to President Woodrow Wilson. The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Have you never realized it, my friends, that Lincoln, though grafted on the West, is essentially in personnel and character a Southern contribution? Quote by Walt Whitman. Illustrated by J.N. Marchand. Published by D. Appleton and Company, New York and London, 1913. Opening of the book. From 1,000 throats rose the cry, Lee to the rear. Dedication to our first Southern-born president since Lincoln, my friend and college mate, Woodrow Wilson. Note to the reader, lest my readers should feel that certain incidents of this story are startling and improbable, I wish to say that every word in it relating to the issues of our national life has been drawn from authentic records in my possession, nor have I at any point taken a liberty with an essential detail in historical scenes. Thomas Dixon, Jr. Prologue. Tom seated himself at the table and looked into his wife's face with a smile. Nancy, it's a meal fit for a king. The supper over, smoked his pipe before the cabin fire of blazing logs while she cleared the wooden dishes. He watched her get the paper, goose quill, pen and ink, as a prisoner sees the scaffold building for its execution. Now we're all ready, she said cheerfully. The man laid his pipe down with a helpless look. A brief respite flashed through his mind. Maybe he could sidestep the lessons before she pinned him down. Lord, Nancy, I forgot my gun. I must grease her right away. He rose with a quick, decisive movement and took his rifle from the rack. She knew it was useless to protest and let him have his way. Over every inch of its heavy barrel and polished walnut stock he rubbed a piece of greased linen with loving care, drew back the flintlock, and greased carefully every nook and turn of its mechanism, lifted the gun finally to his shoulder and drew an imaginary bead on the head of a turkey gobbler 200 yards away. A glowing coal of hickory wood in the fire served for his game. He lowered the gun and held it before him with pride. Nancy, she's the dandiest piece of iron that was ever twisted in the shape of a weapon. Old Speakeasy's her name. She got the softest voice that ever whispered death to a varmint or an Injun. It ain't much louder than the crack of a whip, but man alive, when she talks she says something. Kerpow! She whispers soft and low. She got a voice like yourn, Nancy. Kinder sighs when she speaks. Well, the wife broke in with a shake of her dark head. Has mother's little boy played long enough with his toy? I reckon so. Then it's time for school. She gently took the rifle from his hands, placed it on the buckhorns, and took her seat at the table. The man looked ruefully at the stool, suddenly straightened his massive frame, lifted his hand above his head, and cocked his eye inquiringly. May I get a drink of water first? The teacher laughed in spite of herself. Yes, you big lubber, and hurry up. Tom seized the water bucket and started for the door. Where are you going? She cried in dismay. I'll just run down to the spring for a fresh bucket. Oh, Tom, I'll be right back in a minute, honey, he protested softly. Hit's goin' ter be a powerful hot. I'll need a whole bucket time I'm through. Before she could answer, he was gone. He managed to stay nearly half an hour. She put the baby to sleep and sat waiting with her pensive young eyes gazing at the leaping flames. She heard him stop and answer the call of an owl from the woods. A whippoorwill was softly singing from the bushes nearby. He stopped to call him also, and then found an excuse to linger 10 minutes more fooling with his dogs. The laggard came in at last and dropped on his stool beside her. He sat for 5 minutes staring helplessly at the copy she had set. Big beads of perspiration stood on his forehead. When he took the pen, he held it awkwardly and timidly, as if it were a live reptile. She took his clumsy hand in hers and showed him how to hold it. My, but your hand's soft and sweet, Nancy. Just let me hold that a while. She rapped his knuckles. All right, teacher, I'll be good, he protested and bent his huge shoulders low over his task. He bore so hard on the frail quill pen the ink ran in a big blot. Not so hard, Tom, she cried, but I got so much strength in my right arm, I just can't hold it back. You must try again. He tried again and made a heavy, tremulous line. His arm moved at a snail's gait and wobbled frightfully. Make the line quicker, she urged encouragingly. Begin at the top and come down. Here, you show me how. She took his rough hand quietly in hers and guided it swiftly from right to left in straight, smooth lines until a dozen were made, when he suddenly drew her close, kissed her lips, and held the slender fingers in a grip of iron. She laid in his embrace for a moment, released herself, and turned from him with a sigh. He drew her quickly to the light of the fire and saw the unshed tears in her eyes. What's the use to worry, Nancy gal? Give it up. It's a bad job. I wouldn't fool with no sich scholar if I was you. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. I won't give up, she cried with sudden energy. I can teach you, and I will. I won't give up and be nobody. Oh, Tom, you promised me before we were married to let me teach you. Didn't you promise? Yes, honey, I did. He paused, and his fine teeth gleamed through the black beard. But ye know a feller will promise anything to get his gal. Didn't you mean to keep your word? She broke in sharply. Course I did, Nancy. Never was more earnest in my life, exceptin' when I got religion. But I had no idea learning comes so hard. I'd rather fight Injuns and wildcats, or rob a bee tree any day than to tackle them pothooks you're sickin' after me. Well, I won't give up, she interrupted impatiently, and you just as well make up your mind to stick to it. You can do what other men have done. You're good, honest, and true. You're kind-hearted and popular. They've already made you the road supervisor of this township. Learn to read and write, and you can make a good speech and go to the legislature. Ah, Nancy, what do you want me to do that for, anyhow, gal? I'd be the happiest man in the world, right here in this cabin by the woods, if you'd just be happy with me. Can't you quit hankering after them things, honey? She shook her dark head firmly. You know, Nancy, we was neighbors to Dan'l Boone. We thought he was about the biggest man ever lived. Somehow love of the woods and the fields is always singing in my heart. Them still shining stars up there in the sky out there tonight keep a-calling me. I could hear the music of my hounds in my soul as I stood by the spring a while ago. You know what scares me the most to death sometimes, gal? No, what? She asked. But you'll make a carpenter out of me yet, if I don't mind. Again a smile broke through the cloud in her eyes. I don't think there's much danger of that, Tom. Yes, there is, too. He laughed. You see, I love you so, and I try to make you happy. And if'n there was to come a time that there was a plenty of work and real money in it, I'd stick to it just to please you, and be a lost and ruined soul. Yes, sir. They'd carve on my headstone just one line. Born a man, died a jackleg carpenter. Wouldn't that be awful? The momentary smile on the woman's sensitive face faded into a look of pain. She tried to make a good-natured reply, but her lips refused to move. The man pressed on eagerly. Oh, Nancy, why can't ye be happy here? We got a snug little cabin nest, got enough to eat, enough to wear. The baby's laughing at your heels all day and snuggling in her little bed at night. The birds make music for you in the trees, the creeks down there laughing and singing winter and summer. The world's too purty and life's too short to throw it away a fighting and scrambling for nothing. For something, Tom, something big. Don't care how big 'tis. What of it? All turns to ashes in your hands by and by, and your life's gone. We can't live these young days over again, can we? You know, the preacher says, what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his life? Let me off of these lessons, honey. I'm too old. You can't learn me new tricks. Let me off for good and all, won't ye? No, was the firm answer. Means too much. I won't give up and let the man I love sign his name forever with a cross mark. I ain't going to sign no more papers nohow, Tom broke in. I signed our marriage bond with a mark, Tom, she went on evenly, just because you couldn't write your name. You've got to learn. I won't give up. Well, it's too late tonight for any more lessons now, ain't it? Yes, we'll make up for it next time. The tired hunter was soon sound asleep, dreaming of the life that was the breath of his nostrils. Through the still winter's night, the young wife lay with her wide eyes staring. Over and over again she weighed her chances in the grim struggle begun for the mastery of his mind. The longer she asked herself the question of success or failure, the more doubtful seemed the outcome. How still the world! The new life within her strong young body suddenly stirred, and a feeling of awe thrilled her heart. God had suddenly signaled from the shores of eternity. When her husband waked at dawn, he stared at her smiling face in surprise. What you laughing about, Nancy? He cried. She turned toward him with a startled look. I had a vision, Tom. Dream, I reckon. God had answered the prayer of my heart, she went on breathlessly, and sent me a son. I saw him a strong, brave, patient, wise, gentle man. Thousands hung on his words, and great men came to do him homage. With bowed head he led me into a beautiful home that had shining white pillars. He bowed low and whispered in my ear, This is yours, my angel mother. I bought it for you with my life. All that I am, I owe to you. She paused for a moment and whispered, Oh, Tom, man, a new song is singing in my soul. 2. The woman rose quietly and went the rounds of her daily work. She made her bed today in trance-like silence. It was no gilded couch, but had been built by the hand of her lover and was sacred. It filled the space in one corner of the cabin farthest from the fire. A single post of straight cedar, securely fixed into the ground, held the poles in place which formed the side and foot rail. The walls of the cabin formed the other side and head. Across from the pole were fixed the slender hickory sticks that formed the springy hammock on which the first mattress of moss and grass rested. On this was placed a feather bed made from the wild fowl Tom had killed during the past 2 years. The pillows were of the finest feathers from the breasts of ducks. A single quilt of ample size covered all, and over this was thrown a huge counterpane of bearskins, Two enormous bare rugs almost completely covered the dirt floor, and a carpet of oak leaves filled out the spaces. The feather bed beaten smooth, the fur covering drawn in place, and the pillows set upright against the cabin wall. She turned to the two bunks in the opposite corner and carefully rearranged them. They might be used soon. This was the corner of her home set aside for guests. Tom had skillfully built two berths, boat fashion, one above the other. In this corner, and a curtain drawn over a smooth wooden rod cut this space off from the rest of the room unoccupied at night by visitors. The master of this cabin never allowed a stranger to pass without urging him to stop, and in a way that took no denial. A savory dish of stewed squirrel and corn dumplings served for lunch. The baby's face was one glorious smear of joy and grease at its finish. The mother took the bucket from its shelf and walked leisurely to the spring, whose limpid waters gushed from a rock at the foot of the hill. The child toddled after her, the little moccasin feet stepping gingerly over the sharp gravel of the rough places. Before filling the bucket, she listened again for the crack of Tom's rifle and could hear nothing. A death-like stillness brooded over the woods and fields. He was probably watching for muskrat under the bluff of the creek. He had promised to stay within call today. The afternoon dragged wearily. She tried to read the one book she possessed, the Bible. The pages seemed to fade, and the eyes refused to see. "Oh, man, why don't you come home?" she cried at last. She rose, walked to the door, looked and listened. Only the distant rattle of a woodpecker's beak on a dead tree in the woods. Snow began to fall in little fitful dabs. It was 2 miles to the nearest cabin, and her soul rose in fierce rebellion at the loneliness. It was easy for a man who loved the woods, the fields, and the running waters, this life, but for the woman who must wait and long and eat her heart out alone, she vowed anew that she would not endure it. By the sheer pull of her will, she would lift this man from his drifting life and make him take his place in the real battle of the world. If her new baby were only a boy, he could help her and she would win. Again she stood dreaming of the vision she had seen at dawn. The dark young face suddenly went white, and her hand gripped the facing of the door. She waited, half doubting, half amused at her fears. It was only the twinge of a muscle, perhaps. She smiled at her sudden panic. The thought had scarcely formed before she blanched the second time, and firm lips came together with sudden energy as she glanced at the child playing on the rug at her feet. She seized the horn that hung beside the door and blew the pioneer's long call of danger. Its shrill note rang through the woods against the hills in cadences that seemed half muffled by the falling snow. Again her anxious eyes looked away from the doorway. Would he never come? The trembling, slender hand once more lifted the horn. A single wild note rang out and broke suddenly into silence. The horn fell from her limp grasp as she lifted her eyes to the darkening sky in prayers. Tom's voice from the edge of the woods came strong and full. "Yes, honey, I'm a-comin'." There was no question of doctor or nurse. The young pioneer mother only asked for a mate. For 2 fearful hours she gripped his rough hands until at last her nails brought the blood. But the man didn't know or care. Every smothered cry that came from her lips began to tear the heart out of his body at last. He could hold the long-pent agony no longer. Without words, "My God, Nancy, what can I do for ye, honey?" Her breath came in gasps, and her eyes were shining with a strange intensity. "Nothing, Tom, nothing now. I'm looking death in the face, and I'm not afraid. Please let me give you some whiskey," pleaded, pressing the glass to her lips. No. Take it away. I hate it. My baby shall be clean and strong, or I want to die." The decision seemed to brace her spirit for the last test, when the trembling feet entered the shadow of the dim valley that lies between life and death. The dark, slender figure lay still and white at last. A sharp cry from lusty lungs, and the gray eyes slowly opened, with a timid, wondering look. "Tom!" she cried with quick, eager tones. "Yes, Nancy, yes, a boy, of course. And a buster he is, too. Give him to me, quick." The stalwart figure bent over the bed and laid the little red bundle in her arms. She pressed him tenderly to her heart, felt his breath on her breast, and the joyous tears slowly poured down her cheeks. 3. Before the first year of the boy's life had passed, the task of teaching his good-natured, stubborn father became impossible. The best the wife could do was to make him trace his name in sprawling letters that resembled writing and painfully spell his way through the simplest passage in the Bible. The day she gave up was one of dumb despair. She resolved at last to live in her boy. All she had hoped and dreamed of life should be his, and he would be hers. Her hands could make him good or bad, brave or cowardly, noble or ignoble. He was a remarkable child physically, and grew out of his clothes faster than she could make them. It was easy to see from his second year that he would be a man of extraordinary stature. Both mother and father were above average height, but he would overtop them both. When he tumbled over the bare rugs on the cabin floor, his father would roar with laughter. "For the Lord's sake, Nancy, look at them legs. They're winding blades. If he gets grown, he won't have to ax for a blessing. He can just reach up and hand it down for himself." He was 4 years old when he got the first vision of his mother. That time should never blot out. His father was away on a carpenter job of 4 days, sleeping in the lower bunk of the corner. He waked with a start to hear the chickens cackling loudly. His mother was quietly dressing. He leaped to his feet, shivering in the dark, and whispered, "What is it, Ma?" "Something's after the chickens. Not a hawk. No, nor an owl, or fox or weasel, or they'd squall. They're cackling." The rooster cackled louder than ever, and the boy recognized the voice of his speckled hen, accompanying him. How weird it sounded in the darkness of that still spring night. The cold chills ran down his back, and he caught his mother's dress as she reached for the rifle that stood beside her bed. "You're not going out there, Ma," the boy protested. "Yes, it's a dirty thief after our horse." Her voice was low and steady, and her hand was without tremor as she grasped his. "Get back in bed. I won't be a minute." She left the cabin and noiselessly walked towards the low shed in which the horse was stabled. The boy was at her heels. She knew and rejoiced in the love that made him brave for her sake. She paused for a moment, listened, and then lifted her tall, slim form and advanced steadily. Her bare feet made no noise. The waning moon was shining with soft radiance. The boy's heart was in his throat as he watched her slender neck and head outlined against the sky. Never had he seen anything so calm and utterly brave. There was a slight noise at the stable. The chickens cackled with louder call. 5 minutes passed, and they were silent. A shadowy figure appeared at the corner of the stable. She raised the rifle and flashed a dagger-like flame into the darkness. A smothered cry. The shadow leaped the fence, and the beat of swift feet could be heard in the distance. The boy clung to her side, and his voice was husky as he spoke. "Ain't you afraid, Ma?" The calm answer rang forever through his memory. "I don't know what fear means, my boy. It's not the first time I've caught these prowling scoundrels." Next morning he saw the dark blood marks on the trail over which the thief had fled, and looked into his mother's wistful gray eyes with a new reverence and awe. The boy was quick to know and love the birds of the hedge and field and woods. The martins that built in his gourds on the tall pole had opened his eyes. The red and blue birds, the thrush, the wren, the robin, the catbird, and song sparrows were his daily companions. A mockingbird came at last to build her nest in a bush beside the garden, and her mate began to make the sky ring with his song. The puzzle of the feathered tribe whose habits he couldn't fathom was the whippoorwill. His mother seemed to dislike his ominous sound, but the soft, mournful notes appealed to the boy's fancy. Often at night, he sat in the doorway of the cabin watching the gathering shadows and the flicker of the fire when supper was cooking, listening to the tireless song within a few feet of the house. "Why don't you like 'em, Ma?" he asked, while one was singing with unusually deep and haunting voice, so near the cabin that its echoes seemed to come from the chimney jamb. It was some time before she replied. "They say it's a sign of death for them to come so close to the house." The boy laughed. "You don't believe it?" "I don't know." "Well, I like 'em," he stoutly declared. "I like to feel the cold shivers when they sing right under my feet. You're not afraid of a little whippoorwill?" He looked up into her somber face with a smile. "No," was the gentle answer. "But I want to live to see my boy a fine, strong man." She paused, stooped, and drew him into her arms. There was something in her tones that brought a lump in his throat. The moon was shining in the full white glory of the southern spring. A night of marvelous beauty enfolded the little cabin. He looked into her eyes, and they were shining with tears. "What's the matter?" he asked tenderly. "Nothing, boy. I'm just dreaming of you." The first day of fall in his 6th year, he asked his mother to let him go to the next corn shucking. "You're too little a boy." "I can shuck corn," he stoutly argued. "You'll be good if I let you go." "What's to hurt me there?" "Nothing, unless you let it. The men drink whiskey, the girls dance. Sometimes there's a quarrel or a fight. It won't hurt me if I tend to my own business, will it?" "Nothing will ever hurt you if you'll do just that, boy," the father broke in. "May I go?" "Yes, we're invited next week to a quilting and corn shucking. I'll go with you." The boy shouted for joy and counted the days until the wonderful event. They left home at 2 o'clock in the wagon. The quilting began at 3, the corn shucking at sundown. The house was a marvelous structure to the boy's excited imagination. It was the first home he had seen not built of logs. "Why, Ma, there ain't no logs in the house. How'd they ever put it together?" "With bricks and mortar." The boy couldn't keep his eyes off this building. It was a simple one-story square structure of 4 rooms and an attic, with little dormer windows peeping from the 4 sides of the pointed roof. MacDonald, the thrifty Scots-Irishman from the old world, had built it of bricks he had ground and burnt on his own place. The dormer windows, peeping from the roof, caught the boy's fancy. "Do you reckon his boys sleep up there and peep out of them holes?" The mother smiled. "Maybe so." "Why don't we build a house like that?" he asked at last. "Don't you want it?" The mother squeezed his little hand. "When you're a man, will you build your mother one?" He looked into her eyes a moment, caught the pensive longing, and answered, "Yes, I will." She stooped and kissed the firm mouth and was about to lead him into the large workroom where the women were gathered around the quilts that stretched on their frames, when a Negro slave suddenly appeared to take her horse to the stable. He was fat, jolly, and coal-black. His yellow teeth gleamed in their blue gums with a jovial welcome. The boy stood rooted to the spot and watched until the Negro disappeared. It was the first black man he had ever seen. He had heard of Negroes, that they were slaves, but he had no idea that one human being could be so different from another. In breathless awe he asked, "See, folks?" "Of course, boy," his mother answered, smiling. "What made him so black?" "The sun in Africa." "What made his nose so flat and his lips so thick?" "He was born that way." "What made him come here?" "He didn't. The slave traders put him in chains and brought him across the sea and sold him into slavery." The little boy suddenly stiffened. Why didn't he kill him? He didn't know how to defend himself. Why don't he run away? He hasn't sense enough, I reckon. He's got a home, plenty to eat, plenty to wear, and he's afraid he'll be caught and whipped. The mother had to pull the boy with her into the quilting room. His eyes followed the Negro to the stable with a strange fascination. The thing that puzzled him beyond all comprehension was why a big, strong man like that, if he were a man, would submit. Why didn't he fight and die? A curious feeling of contempt filled his mind. This black thing that looked like a man, walked like a man, talked like a man, couldn't be a man. No real man would grin and laugh and be a slave. The black fool seemed to be happy. He had not only grinned and laughed, but he went away whistling and singing. In 3 hours the quilts were finished, and the men had gathered for the corn shucking. Before 8 o'clock the last ear was shucked, and a long white pile of clean husked corn lay glistening in the moonlight where the dark pyramid had stood at sunset. With a shout the men rose, stretched their legs, and washed their hands in the troughs filled with water provided for the occasion. They sat down to supper at 4 long tables placed in the kitchen and workrooms where the quilts had been stretched. Never had the boys seen such a feast. Barbecued shote, turkeys, ducks, chickens, venison, bear meat, sweet potatoes, wild honey, corn dodgers, wheat biscuits, stickies, and pound cake. Pound cake until you couldn't eat another mouthful, and they still brought more. After the supper, the young folks sang and danced before the big fires until 10 o'clock, and then the crowd began to thin, and by 11, the last man was gone and the harvest festival was over. It was nearly 12 before the boy knelt at his mother's knee to say his prayers. When the last words were spoken, he still knelt, his eyes gazing into the flickering fire. The mother bent low. "What are you thinking, boy? The house you're going to build for me?" "No. What? That nigger. Wasn't he funny? You don't want me to get you any niggers with the house, do you?" "No." "I didn't think you would," he went on thoughtfully, "because you said General Washington sent his slaves free and wanted everybody else to do it too." He paused and shook his head thoughtfully. "But he was funny. He was laughing and whistling and singing." 5. The air of the southern autumn was like wine. The boy's heart beat with a new life. The scarlet and purple glory of the woods fired his imagination. He found himself whistling and singing at his tasks. He proudly showed a bee tree to his mother. The honey was gathered and safely stored, a barrel of walnuts, a barrel of hickory nuts, and 2 bushels of chestnuts were piled near his bed in the loft. But the day his martins left, he came near breaking down. He saw them circle high in graceful sweeping curves over the gourds, chattering and laughing with a strange new note in their cries. He watched them wistfully. His mother found him, looking with shining eyes far up into the still autumn sky. His voice was weak and unsteady when he spoke. "I can hardly hear 'em now, they're so high." A slender hand touched his tangled hair. "Don't worry, boy. They'll come again." "You're sure, Ma?" he asked pathetically. "Sure." "Will they know when it's time?" "Someone always tells them." "Who?" "God. That's what the Bible means, when it says the stork knoweth her appointed time. I read that to you the other night, don't you remember? But maybe God'll be so busy he'll forget my birds." "He never forgets. He counts the beat of a sparrow's wings." The mother's faith was contagious. The drooping spirit caught the flash of light from her eyes and smiled. Comforted at last, he went to the woods to gather chinquapins. The squirrels were scampering in all directions, and he asked his father that night to let him go hunting with him next day. "All right, boy," was the hearty answer. "We'll have some fun this winter." He paused as he saw the mother's lips suddenly close and a shadow pass over her dark, sensitive face. "It's no use worry, Nancy," he went on good-naturedly. "I promised you not to take him unless he wanted to go, but it's in the blood and it's got to come out. Tom picked the boy up and placed him on his knee and stroked his dark head. Sarah crouched at his feet and smiled. He was going to tell about the Indians again. She could tell by the look in his eyes as he watched the flames leap over the logs. "Did you know, boy," he began slowly, "that we come out to Kentuck with Dan'l Boone?" "Did we?" "Yes, sirree, with old Dan'l himself. It was 30 year ago. I was a little shaver no bigger than you, but I remember just as well as if it was yesterday. Lordy, boy, there was her man that was her man. You couldn't make no jackleg carpenter out of him." He paused and cast a slight wink at Nancy as she bent over her knitting. "Tell me about him," the boy cried. "Yes, sir, Dan'l Boone was a man, and no mistake. The Injuns would catch him and keep catching him, and he'd slip right through their fingers, slicker'n an eel. The very first trip he took out of here, he was captured by the Redskins. Dan'l was with his friend John Sturt. They left their camp one day and set out on a big hunt, and all of a sudden they was grabbed by the Injuns. Why didn't they shoot 'em?" the boy asked. "There was too many of 'em, and they was too quick for Dan'l. He didn't have no show at all. The Injuns robbed 'em of everything they kept and kept 'em prisoners. But old Dan'l was a slickin'. And he knowed 'em from a tur-izzard. They didn't have nothing but bows and arrows, and he had a rifle that's just like mine. He never got flustered or riled up by the way they was treating him, but he let on like he was happy as a June bug. Dan'l would raise his rifle, put a bullet twixt a buffalo's eye, and he'd drap on his tracks. The Injuns was tickled to death and thought him the greatest man to ever live, and he was, too. So they got ter liking him and treating him better. For 7 days and nights, him and Sturt helped him hunt and showed him how to work on a rifle. The Injuns was plumb fooled by Dan'l's friendly ways and didn't watch him so close. So one night Dan'l helped 'em ter get a bigger supper than ever was. They was all full enough to bust and went to sleep and slept like logs. It was a dark night and the fire burned low. And long about midnight Dan'l make it up his mind to give 'em the slip. It was a dangerous job. If he failed, he was death sure enough, for nothing makes an Injun so pizzin' mad as for anybody to be treated nice by him and then try to get away. The Redskins was all sleeping round the fire. They was used ter jumping in the middle of the night at any minute. Maybe they was all asleep, or maybe they wasn't. Old Dan'l, he pretended to be sleeping, the sleep of the dead, and as I tell you, he was mighty careful. Shook Stewart easy, waked him up, and motioned to him to foller. Talk about sneaking up on a wild duck or a turkey. Old Dan'l done some slick business getting away from that fire. Man, if they'd have rustled a leaf or broke a twig, them savages would have all been up and on 'em in a minute. Holding tight to their guns, you can bet they didn't leave 'em. And a stepping light as feathers, they crept away from the fire and out into the deep dark of the woods. They stopped and stood as still as death and watched till they'd see the Indians hadn't waked. The pioneer paused, and his white teeth shone through his black beard as he cocked his shaggy head to one side and looked into the boy's wide eyes. "And then what do you reckon old Dan'l Boone done, sir?" "What?" "Well, you seed the way them bees made for their trees, didn't ye, when they got a load of their honey?" "Yes, that's the way I found their home." "But you had daylight, mind you, and Dan'l was in pitch black night. But, sir, he made a bee-line through them dark woods straight for his camp he'd left 7 days 'fore. And, man, yer can bet that they made tracks when they got clear of those Redskins. It was 6 hours today when the Injuns waked. They didn't know which way to look." Tom paused, and the boy cried eagerly. "Did they get there?" "Get whar?" the father asked dreamily. "Get back to their own camp. Straight as a bee line, I tell ye. But the camp had been busted and robbed, and the other men was gone. Gone where? Tom shook his shaggy head. Nobody ever knowed her this day. Reckon the Injun scalped 'em. He paused again, and a dreamy look overspread his rugged face. Like they scalped your own grandpa that day. Did they scalp my grandpa? The boy asked in an awed whisper. That they did. Your Uncle Mordecai and me was working with him in the new ground, cleaning it up for corn, when all of a sudden Injuns rised up out the ground. Your grandpa dripped dead, first shot, and Mordecai flew to the cabin for the rifle. Big Redskin jumped over a log and scalped my own daddy before my eyes. He grabbed me and started pulling me to the woods, and then, Sonny, something happened. Tom looked at the long rifle and its buckhorn's rest and smiled. Old Speakeasy up there stretched her long neck through a chink in the logs and said something to Mr. Redskin. She didn't raise her voice much louder than a whisper. She just kind of sighed. Kerpow! I can hear it echoing through them woods yet. That Injun draped my hands before I heard the gun, and she hadn't more'n sung out before he was a lying in a heap at my feet. The ball had gone clean through him. Tom paused again and looked for a long time in silence into the glowing coals. The little cabin was very still. The boy lifted his face to his mother's curiously. Ma, you said God counted the beat of a sparrow's wing. Yes. Well, what was he doing when that Indian scalped my grandpa? The mother threw a startled look at the little boy, the bold little questioner, and answered reverently, Keeping watch in heaven, my boy. The hairs of your head are numbered, and not one falls without his knowledge. We had to pay the price of blood for this beautiful country. Nothing is ever worth having that doesn't cost precious lives. Again the cabin was still. An owl's deep cry boomed from the woods, and a solitary wolf answered in the distance. The boy's brow was wrinkled for a moment, and he suddenly looked up to his father's rugged face. And what became of Dan'l Boone? Oh, he lit out on his feet all right. He always did. He moved on with Stewart, built him another camp in the deepest woods he could find, and hunted there all winter. Just think, boy, all winter, every day, there was a man that was a man, sure enough. Yes, sirree, the listener agreed. The mother lifted her head and thoughtfully watched the sparkling eyes. And do you want to know why Daniel Boone was great, my son? She asked quietly. Yes, why? Was the quick response. Because he used his mind and his hands, while other men around him just used their hands. He learned to read and write when he was a little boy. He mixed brains with his powder and shot. Did he, Paul? The questioner cried. Father smiled. He could afford to be generous. The boy looked to him as the authority on Daniel Boone. Yes, reckon he did. He was smart. I didn't have no chance when I was little. Then I'm going to learn, too. Ma can teach me. He leaped from his father's lap and climbed into hers. You will, won't you, Mom? The mother smiled as she slowly answered, Yes, honey. I'll begin tomorrow night, and you get back from hunting. 6. Slowly but surely, the indomitable will within the boy's breast conquered the cries of aching muscles, and he went about his daily farm tasks with the dogged persistence of habit. He had learned to whistle at his work, and his eager mind began to look for new worlds to conquer. At the right moment, the tempter appeared. It rained on Saturday, and Austin, his neighbor, came over to see him. They cracked walnuts and hickory nuts in the loft while the rain pattered noisily on the board roof. Austin had a definite suggestion for Sunday that would break the monotony of life. Let's me and you not go to her meeting tomorrow, the neighbor ventured for a starter. All right, the boy agreed. Preaching makes me tired anyhow. Me too, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll get my ma to let me come to your house to stay all day. When your folks go off to meeting, me and you will have some fun. What? We'll stay all day on the creek banks, find duck nests, turkey and quail nests, and... Austin paused and dropped his voice. Go in swimming if we take a notion. The boy slowly shook his head. No, let's not do that. Why? "'Cause Ma don't allow me to go in the creek till June. Says I might catch my death of cold." "Shucks! I've been in twice already." "Have ye?" "Yep." "And you didn't get sick?" "Do I look sick?" "Not a bit." "Well then, all right, we'll go." The spirit of freedom born of the fields and woods had grown into something more than an attitude of mind. He was ready for the deed, the positive act of adventure. He didn't like to disobey his mother, but he couldn't afford to let Austin think that he was a mollycoddle, a mere babe hanging to her skirts. He was doing a man's work. It was time he took a few of the man's privileges. He reveled in the situation of adventure that night and saw himself a hero of stirring scenes. Next morning on Austin's arrival, he asked his mother to let him stay at home and play. "Don't you want to go to meeting and hear the new preacher?" she asked persuasively. "No, I'm tired." The mother smiled indulgently. He was young, far too young yet to know the meaning of true religion. She was a Baptist, and the first principle of her religion was personal faith and direct relations of the individual soul with God. She remembered her own hours of torture in childhood. "All right, boy. Be good now while we're gone." His big toe was digging in the dirt while he murmured, "Yes'm." The wagon had no sooner disappeared than he and Austin were flying with swift bare feet along the path that led to the creek. It was the hottest day of spring, a close air and broiling sun to be remembered longer than the hottest day of August. They ran for a mile without pause, rolled in the sand on the banks of the creek, and shouted their joy in perfect freedom. Then they explored the deep cane brakes and stalked imaginary buffaloes and bears without number, encountering nothing bigger than a gray fox and a couple muskrats. "Let's cross over," Austin cried. "I saw a bear track on that side the other day. We can trail him to his den and show him to your pap when he comes home. Here's the log." The boy looked dubiously, measured it with his eye, and shook his head. "Nope. It's too little and too high in the air. It'll wobble." "But we can coon over it," Austin urged. "We can grab a hold of a limb over there and slide down. It's easy. Come on." Before he could make further objections, the young adventurer quickly straddled the swaying pole and with the agility of a cat hopped across, grasped one of the limbs, and slipped to the sand. "Come on," he shouted. "See how easy it is?" The boy looked doubtfully at the swaying sapling and wished he had gone to hear that preacher after all. It would never do to say he was afraid. The other fellow had done it so quickly, and it was no use to argue with Austin that his legs were shorter, his body more compact, and so much easier to hold on to his balance. The idea of cowardice was something too vile for thought. The boy felt he was doomed to fall before he moved, but he waved a brave little hand in the air. "All right, I'm coming." Halfway across, the pole began to tear its roots from the bluff. He felt it sinking, stopped, and held his breath as it suddenly broke with a crash and fell. "Look out! Hold tight!" He did his best, but lost his balance and toppled head downward into the deep, still water. His mouth flew open at the first touch of the chill stream. He gasped for breath and drew in his lungs a strangling flood. The blood rushed to his brain in a wild explosion of terror. He struck out madly with his long arms and legs, fighting with desperation for breath and drinking in only the agony and fear of death. His mother's voice came low and faint, far away in some other world, saying softly, "Be good now while we're gone." Again he struck out blindly, fiercely, madly into the darkness that was slowly swallowing him body and soul. His hand touched something as he sank. He grasped it with instinctive terror and knew no more until he walked into the infernal regions with the devil sitting on his stomach, glaring into his eyes and holding him by the throat, trying to choke him to death. His head was down a steep hill. With a mighty effort he threw the devil off, loosed his hold, and sucked in a tiny breath of air, and then another, and another, coughing and spluttering, and wheezing foam and water from his mouth and ears and nose and eyes. At last a voice gasped, "Is that you, Austin? You bet it's me. I got you breathing all right. Now, who'd you think it was?" The boy coughed and squeezed his lungs clear of water. "Why, I was afraid I was dead, and you was the old scratch and had me. Well, I thought you were a goner sure enough, till your hand grabbed the pole I stuck in after ye. Man alive, but you did hold on to it. I liken to never got your hand loose so I can pull you up on the bank and turn you upside down and squeeze the water out of you. Did you sit on my stomach and choke me? The boy asked. I sat on you and mashed the water out, but I didn't choke you, though. I thought old Scratch had me. For an hour they talked in awed whispers of sin and death and trouble, and then the blood of youth shook off the nightmare. They were alive and unhurt. They were all right. And it was a good joke. They swore eternal secrecy. That day was yet young, and it was a glorious one. Their clothes were wet, and they had to be dried before night. That settled it. They would strip, hang their clothes in the hot sun, and wall in the sand and play in the shallow water till sundown. And besides, Austin urged, this here is a warning straight from the Lord. Me and you must learn to swim. That's so, ain't it? The boy said. It's what I calls a sign from on high, and it points right into the creek. They agreed that the thing to do was to heed at once this divine revelation and devote the whole Sabbath day to the solemn work in the creek. They found a beautifully sunny spot with an immense sandbar and a wide, shallow, safe waters. They carefully placed their clothes to dry and basked in the bright sun. They practiced swimming in water waist deep, and Austin learned to make 3 strokes and reach the length of his body before sinking. They rolled in the sun again and ate their lunch. They ran naked through the woods to a branch that flowed into the creek, followed it to the source, and drank at a beautiful spring. Through the long afternoon they lived in a fairy world of freedom, of dreams and make-believe. They talked to great hunters and discussed the best methods of attacking all manner of wild beasts. The sun was sinking towards the western hills when they hastily picked up their clothes, found a safe ford across which they could wade, holding their things above their heads. The boy reached the house just as the wagon drove up to the door. He hurried to help his father with the horse. A sense of elation filled his mind that he was shrewd enough to keep his own secrets. Of course, his mother needn't know what happened. He was none the worse for it. In answer to her question of how he spent the day, he vaguely answered, In the woods. They're awful pretty now with the dogwood all in bloom. He talked incessantly at supper, teasing Sarah about her jolly time at the meeting. Toward the end of the meal, he grew silent. A curious sensation began on his back and shoulders and arms. He paid no attention at first, but it rapidly grew worse. The more he tried to shake off the feeling, the more distant and sharp it grew. At last, every inch of his body seemed to be on fire. He rose slowly from the table and walked to the stool in the corner, wondering and fearing. He sat in dead silence for half an hour. The perspiration began to stand out on his forehead. It was no use longer to try and fool himself. There was something the matter, something big, something terrible. A fierce and scorching fever was burning him to death. He dared not move. Every muscle quivered with agony when he tried. The mother's keen eye saw the tears he couldn't keep back. What's the matter, boy? She tenderly asked while his father was at the stable, putting the wagon under the shed. I don't know. He choked. I'm all on fire, burning up. She touched his forehead and slipped her arm around his shoulders. He screamed with pain. The mother looked into his face with a sudden start. Why, what on earth, child? What have you been doing today? He hesitated and tried to be brave, but it was no use. He felt that he would drop dead the next moment, unless relief came. He buried his face in his lap and sobbed his bitter confession. Do you think I'm going to die? He asked. She smiled. No, my boy, you're only sunburned. How long were you naked in the sun? From about 10 o'clock to nearly sundown. He mewed again and screamed with agony. The mother tenderly undressed the little red, swollen body. The rough clothes had stuck to the blistered skin in one place, and the pain was so frightful he nearly fainted before they were finally removed. For 2 days and nights she never left his side, holding his hand to give him courage when he was compelled to move. Almost his entire body, inch by inch, was blistered. She covered it with cream and allowed only 2 greased linen cloths to touch him. On the second day, as he laid panting for breath and holding her hand with feverish grasp, he looked at her pensive gray eyes through his own bleared and bloodshot with pain and said softly, I'm sorry, Ma. She pressed his hand. It's all right, my boy. Your mother loves you. I'm not sorry for the pain, he grasped. What hurts me worse is that you're so sweet to me. The dark face bent and kissed his trembling lips. It's all for the best. You couldn't have understood the preacher Sunday. when he took the text. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. You learned it for yourself, the only way we really learn anything. God's in the wind and rain, the sun and the storm. All nature works with him. You can easily fool your mother. It's not what you seem to others. It's what you are that counts. God sees and knows. You see and know in your little heart. I want you to be a great man. Only a good man can ever be great. And so, for an hour, she poured into his heart her faith in God and his glory, until he became the one power fixed forever in the child's imagination. 7. The boy lost his skin, but grew another and incidentally absorbed some ideas that he never forgot. On the day he was able to put on his clothes, it poured down rain, and work in the fields was impossible. A sense of delicious joy filled him. He worked because he had to, not because he liked it. He was too proud to shirk, too brave to cry when every nerve and muscle of his little body ached with mortal weariness, but he hated it. The sun rose bright and warm and shone clear in the southern sky next morning. Before he was called, he climbed down the ladder from his loft, wondering what marvelous thing had happened, that he should be sleeping with the sun already high in the heavens. "What's the matter, Ma?" he asked anxiously. "Why didn't you call me?" "It's too wet to plow. Your father has gone to chop wood in the clearing. He wanted you to pile brush after him, but I asked him to let you off to go fishing for me." He ate breakfast with his heart beating a tattoo, rushed into the garden, dug a gourd full of worms, drew his long cane rod from the eaves of the cabin, and with old Boney trotting down at his heels, was soon on his way to a deep pool in the bend of the creek. Fishing for her. His mother understood. He wondered why he had ever been fool enough to disobey her that Sunday. He could die for her without a moment's hesitation. It was glorious to have this marvelous day of spring all his own. The birds were singing on every field and hedge. The trees flashed their polished new leaves. The sweet languor of the south was in the air, and he drew it in with deep breaths that sent the joy of life tingling through every vein. 4 joyous hours flew on tireless wings. He had caught 5 catfish and a big eel, more than enough for a good meal for the whole family. He held them up proudly. How his mother's eyes would sparkle. He could see Sarah's admiring gaze and hear his father's good-natured approval. He had just struck the path for home when the forlorn figure of a rough-bearded man came limping to meet him. He stepped aside in the grass to let him pass, but the man stopped and gazed at the fish. My, sonny, but you got a fine string there," he exclaimed. "Pretty good for one day," the boy proudly answered. "Just to think, I ain't got nothing to eat in most 2 days. Don't you live nowhere?" the youngster asked in surprise. "I used to have a home before the war, but my folks thought I was dead and moved away. I'm trying to find them. It's a hard job with the Britishers' bullets still pinching me in the leg." "Did you fight with General Washington?" "Lordy, no, I ain't that old. If I do look like a scarecrow. No, I fought under old Hickory at New Orleans. I tell you, sonny, them Britishers burnt out Washington for us, but we give 'em a taste of fire at New Orleans. They ain't a-goin' to forget. Did we lick 'em good? Boy, you ain't never heard tell such a scrimmage. We thrashed 'em till they weren't no fighting 'em all, and they scrambled back aboard them ships and skedaddled home. Britishers can't fight nohow. We licked 'em twice, and we can lick 'em again. But the old soldier that does the fighting, everybody forgets him." The boy looked longingly at his string of fish for a moment, with the pride of his heart, and then held up his treasure. "You can have my fish if you want 'em. They'll make you a nice supper." The old soldier stroked the tangled hair and took his string of fish. "You're a fine boy. I won't forget you, sonny." The words comforted him when he neared the house, and then a sense of bitter loss welled up in spite of it all. "Did I do right, Ma?" he asked wistfully. She placed her hand on his forehead. "Yes, I'm proud of you. I know what that gift cost a boy's heart. It was big, because it was all you had, and the pride of your soul was in it." The sense of loss was gone, and he was rich and happy again. When the supper was over and they sat before the flickering firelight, he asked her a question over which his mind had puzzled since he left the old soldier. "Why is it," he asked thoughtfully, "British soldiers can't fight?" The mother smiled. Who said they can't fight? The old soldier gave 'em a fish too. He said we would just make hash out of 'em again. We licked 'em twice and we can do it again. The last sentence he didn't quote. He gave it as a personal opinion based on established facts. We didn't win because the British couldn't fight, the mother gravely responded. Then why? He persisted. The Lord was good to us. How? The question came with an accent of indignation. Sometimes he couldn't help getting cross with his mother when she began to give the Lord credit for everything. If the Lord did it all, why should he give his string of fish to an old soldier? The gray eyes looked into his with wistful tenderness. She had been shocked once before by the fear that there was something in this child's eternal why that would keep him out of the church. The one deep desire of her heart was that he should be good. Would you like to hear, she began softly, something about the revolution which my old school teacher told me in Virginia? Yes, tell me. He said that we could never have won our independence but for God. We didn't win because the British soldiers couldn't fight. We held out for 10 years because we outran them. We ran quicker, covered more ground, got further into the woods, and stayed there longer than any fighters the British had ever met before. That's why we got the best of them. Our men who fought and ran away lived to fight another day. General Washington was always great in retreat. He never fought unless he was ready and could choose his own field. He waited until his enemies were in a snug quarters, drinking and gambling. And then on a dark night, so dark and cold that some of his own men would freeze to death, he pushed across a river, fell on them, cut them to pieces, and retreated. The number of men he commanded was so small that he could not face his foes in the open if he could avoid it. His men were poorly armed, poorly drilled, half-clothed, and half-starved at times. The British troops were the best drilled and finest fighting men of the world in their day, armed with good guns, well-fed, well-clothed, and well-paid. She paused and smiled at the memory of her teacher's narrative. What do you suppose happened on one of our battlefields? I don't know what. When the Redcoats charged, our boys ran at the first crack of a gun. They ran so well that they all got away except one little fella who had a game leg. He stumbled and fell in a hole. A big British soldier raised a musket to brain him. The little fellow looked up and cried, All right, kill away. Dang ye, you won't get much. The Britisher laughed, picked him up, brushed his clothes, and told him to go home. The boy laughed again and again. He was a spunky one anyhow, wasn't he? Yes, the mother nodded, and that's why the Redcoats let him go. And we never could have endured if God hadn't inspired one man to hold fast when the others' hearts had failed. And who was he? The boy broke. General Washington. At Valley Forge, our cause was lost, but for him. Our men weren't paid. They couldn't get clothes. They were freezing and starving. They quit and went home in hundreds and gave up in despair. And then, boy, her voice dropped to a tense whisper, General Washington fell on his knees and prayed until he saw the shining face of God and got his answer. The next day, he called his ragged, hungry men together and said, Soldiers, though all my armies desert, the war shall go on. If I must, I'll gather my faithful followers in Virginia, retreat to the mountains, and fight until our country's free. His words cheered the despairing men, and they stood by him. We were saved at last because help came in time. Lord Cornwallis had laid the South in ashes and camped at Yorktown, his army of veterans, laden with spoils. He was only waiting for the transports from New York to take his victorious men north, join the army there, and end the war. And then, she drew a deep breath and her eyes sparkled, and then, boy, it happened, a miracle. Into the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, 3 big ships dropped anchor at the mouth of York River. Our people on the shore thought they were the transports and that the end had come. But the ships were too far away to make out their flag, and so they sent swift couriers across the peninsula to see if there were any signs. In the roadstead at Hampton, there, glory to God, lay a great fleet flying the flag of France. The French had loaned us $20 million and had sent their navy and army to help us. Had the Lord sent down a host from the sky, we couldn't have been more surprised. They landed, joined with General Washington's ragged men, and closed in on Cornwallis. Surprised and trapped, he surrendered, and we won. But there never was a year before that, my boy, that we were strong enough to resist the British Army, had the mother country sent a real general here to command their troops. Why didn't she? The boy interrupted. Again the mother's voice dropped low. Because God wouldn't let her. And that's the only reason. If Lord Clive had ever landed on our shores, Washington might now be sleeping in a traitor's grave. The voice again became soft and dreamy, almost inaudible. And he didn't come, the boy whispered. No. On the day he was to sail, he put the papers in his pocket, went into his room, locked the door, and blew his own brains out. This is God's country, my son. He gave us freedom. He has great plans for us. The fire flickered low, and the boy's eyes glowed with a strange intensity. 8. A barbecue, with political speaking, was held at the village, 10 miles away. The family started at sunrise. The day was an event in the lives of every man, woman, and child within a radius of 20 miles. Many came as far as 30 miles and walked the whole distance. Before 9 o'clock, a crowd of 2,000 had gathered. The dark, lithe young mother led her boy by the hand down the crowded aisle of the improvised brush arbor that day, performed a deed which was destined to change the history of the world. The speaker who held the crowd spellbound for 2 hours was Henry Clay. The boy not only heard an eloquent orator, his spirit entered for all time into fellowship with a great human soul. In words that throbbed with passion, he pictured the coming glory of a mighty nation whose shores would be washed by 2 oceans, whose wealth and manhood would be the hope and inspiration of the world. Never before had words been given such wings. The ringing tones found the boy's soul and set his brain on fire. A big idea was born within his breast. This was his country. His feet pressed its soil. Its hills and plains, rivers and seas were his. His hands would help to build this vision of a great spirit into a living thing. He breathed softly and his eyes sparkled. When the crowd cheered, he leaped to his feet, swung his little cap in the air, and shouted with all his might. When the last glowing picture of the peroration faded into a silence that could be felt, and the tumult had died away, he saw men and women crowding around the orator to shake his hand. "Take me, Ma," he whispered. "I want to see him close." The mother lifted him in her arms above the crowd, pressed forward, and the boy's shining eyes caught those of the brilliant statesman. Over the heads of the men by his side, the orator extended his hand and grasped the trembling, outstretched fingers. He smiled and nodded, that was all. The boy understood. From that moment, he had an ideal leader whose words were inspired. The mother's dark face was lit for a moment with tender pride. She made no effort to reach the orator's side. It was enough that she had seen the flash from her boy's eyes. She was content. The day was filled with a great joy. The summer camp meetings began the following week. The grounds were located a mile from the straggling little village which was the center of the county's activities. All religious denominations used the spacious auditorium for their services. The Methodists camped there an entire month. The Baptists stayed but 2 weeks. The Baptist temperament frowned on social frivolities, which were inseparable from those long intimate associations at close quarters. The more volatile temperament of the Methodists reveled in them. And Methodism grew with astounding rapidity under the system. The auditorium was simple, a huge quadrangular shed with a board roof, upheld by cedar posts. At one end of the shed stood the platform on which was built the pulpit, a square, box-like structure about 4 feet high. The seats were made of rough-hewn half-logs, set on pegs driven into auger holes. There were no backs to them. A single wide aisle led from the end facing the pulpit, and 2 narrow ones intersected the main aisle at the center. In front of the pulpit were placed the mourners' benches, facing the three sides of the spaces left for the free movement of the mourners under the stress of religious emotions. The boy's mother and father were devout members of the Baptist Church, but they were not demonstrative. They modestly and reverently took their seats in an inconspicuous position about midway in the building, entering from one of the small aisles of the church. The boy had often been to a regular church service before, but this was his first camp meeting. 4 preachers sat in grim silence behind the pulpit's solid box. The boy could just see the tops of their heads over the board that held the big, gilt-edged Bible. The entire first 2 days and nights were given to a series of terrific sermons on death, hell, and judgment, with a brief glimpse of the pearly gates of heaven, and a few strains from the golden harps inside for the damned to hear by way of contrast. The first purpose of the preachers was to arouse a deep undercurrent of religious emotional excitement that, at the proper moment, would explode and sweep the crowd with resistless fire. Usually the fuse was timed to explode on the morning of the third day. Sometimes, when sermons of extraordinary power had followed each other in rapid succession, the fire broke out by a sort of spontaneous combustion on the night of the second day. It did so this time. The mother had no trouble keeping the boy by her side. Through these first 2 days, he felt instinctively the growing emotional tension about him and knew in his bones that something would break loose soon. He was keyed to a high pitch of interest to see just what it would be like. The storm broke in the middle of the second sermon on the second night. The preacher had worked himself into a frenzy of emotional excitement. His arms were waving over his head, his eyes blazing, his feet stamping, his voice screaming in anguish as he described the agony of a soul lost forever in the seething cauldron of eternal hellfire. A tremulous, startled moan, half wail, half scream, came from a girl just in front of the boy as she dropped her head into her hands. "What's the matter with her?" he whispered. "Has she got a pain?" His mother pressed his hand. "Shh!" And then the storm broke. From every direction came the startled cries of long-pent terror and anguish. The girl staggered to her feet and started stumbling down the aisle to the mourner's bench without invitation. And from every row of seats they tumbled, crowding on her heels, sobbing, wailing, screaming, groaning. The preacher ceased to talk, and in a high, tremulous voice that rang through the excited crowd as the peal of the archangel's trumpet began to sing, "Come, humble sinners, in whose breasts 1,000 thoughts revolve." The crowd rose instinctively, and all who were not mourning joined in the half-savage, terror-stricken wail of the song. The sinners hadn't given up at the first break of the storm, could not resist the thrill of this wild music. One by one they pushed their way through the crowd, found the aisle, and staggered blindly to the front. The boy noticed curiously that it seemed to be the rule for them to completely cover their streaming eyes with a handkerchief or with bare hands and go blindly for the mourners' benches. If they missed the way and butted into anything, a church member kindly took them by the arm and guided them to a vacant place where they dropped to their knees. The boy had leaped on the bench and stood beside his mother to get a better view of the turmoil. He couldn't keep his eyes off a tall, red-headed, thick-bearded man just across the aisle 3 rows behind who kept twitching his face, looking towards the door and struggling against the impulse to follow the mourners. Presently he broke down with a loud cry, "Lord, have mercy!" He placed his hands over his face and started on a run to the front. The boy giggled and his mom pinched him. "Did you see that redhead feller, Ma?" he whispered. "He didn't do fair. He peeked through his fingers. I saw his eyes." "Shh!" The preacher had come down from the pulpit now and stood over the wailing, prostrated mourners and exhorted them to repent and believe before it was forever and eternally too late. 3 of them were talking at the same time to different groups of mourners. The louder they exhorted, the louder the sinners cried. The 4th preacher walked down the aisle, searching for those who were yet hardening their hearts and stiffening their necks. He paused beside a prim little old maid who had lately arrived from Tidewater, Virginia. Her bright eyes were dry. "Dear lady, are you a child of God?" the preacher cried. The prim figure stiffened indignantly. "No, sir. I'm an Episcopalian." The preacher groaned and passed on, and the boy stuffed his fist into his mouth. For half an hour the roar of the conflict was incessant, and its violence indescribable. It was broken now and then by a kindly soul among the elderly women raising a sweet old-fashioned hymn. Suddenly an exhorter threw his hands above his head, and in a voice that soared above the roar of mourners and their attendants cried, "Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world." Quick as a flash came an answering shout from the red-headed man, who leaped to his feet, with wide staring eyes looked up at the roof. "I see him! I see Jesus up a tree!" A fat woman lifted her head and shouted, "Hold him till I get there!" And he started for the red-headed man. There was a single moment of strange silence, and the boy laughed aloud. His mother caught him and shook him violently. He crammed his little fist again into his mouth, but the stopper wouldn't hold. He dropped to his seat. To keep the people from seeing him, buried his face in his hands and laughed and smothered giggles in spite of all his mother could do. At last he whispered, "Take me out quick. I'm going to bust. I'll bust wide open, I'll tell you." She rose sternly, seized his arm, and led him half a mile into the woods. He kept looking back and laughing softly. She gazed at him sorrowfully. "I'm ashamed of you, boy. How could you do such a thing?" "I just couldn't help it." He sat down on a stone and laughed again. "What makes the fools holler so?" he asked through his tears. "They are praying that God forgives their sins." "But why holler so loud? He ain't deaf, is he? You said that God's in the sun and wind and dew and rain and the breath we breathe. Ain't he everywhere then? Why they holler at him?" The mother turned away to hide a smile she couldn't keep back, and a cloud overspread her dark face. Surely this was an evil sign. This spirit of irreverent levity in a mind of a child so young. What could it mean? She had forgotten that she had been teaching him to think, and didn't know, perhaps, that he who thinks must laugh or die. After she let him spend long hours in the spring playing with the boys and girls of his age. He didn't go to the meetings again, but he enjoyed the season. The watermelons, muskmelons, and ginger cakes were the best he had ever eaten. 9. During the Christmas holidays, the father got ready for a coon hunt, in which the boy should see his first battle royal in the world of sport. Dennis came over and brought 4 extra dogs, 2 of his own and 2 which he had borrowed for the holidays. A sudden change came over the spirit of old Boney, short for Napoleon Bonaparte. He understood the talk about coons as clearly as if he could speak the English language. He was in a quiver of eager excitement. He knew from the boys' talk that he was going, too. Wagged his tail, pushed his warm nose under his little friend's arm, whining and trembling while he tried to explain what it meant to strike a coon's trail in the deep night. Chase him over miles of woods and swamps and field, tree him and fight it out. A battle to the death between dog and beast. At 2 o'clock before day, his father's voice called, and in a jiffy he was down the ladder, his eyes shining. He had gone to sleep with his clothes on, and lost no time in dressing. Without delay the start was made, down the dim pathway to the creek, and then along its banks for 2 miles, its laughing waters rippling soft music amid the shadows, or gleaming white and mirror-like in the starlit open spaces. In half an hour the stars were obscured by a thin veil of fleecy clouds, and striking no trail in the bottoms, they turned to the big track of woods on the hills and plunged straight into their depths for 2 miles. "Hush!" Tom suddenly stopped. Far off to the right came the bark of a dog on the run. "Ain't that old Boney's voice?" the father asked. "I don't think so," the boy answered. The note of wild, savage music was one he had never heard before. "Yes, it were, too," said the emphatic decision. He squared his broad shoulders and gave the hunter's shout of answer joy to the dog's call. Never had the boy heard such a shout from human lips. It sent shivers down his spine. The dog heard, and louder came the answering note, a deep, tremulous boom through the woods that meant to the older man's trained ear that he was on the run. "That there's old Boney, sure as you're born," says the father cried, "and he ain't got no doubts about it nuther. He got his head in the air. The trail's hot. He don't have ter nose the ground. You'll hear something in a minute when the younger pups get to him." Two hounds suddenly opened with long, quivering wails. "There's my dogs. They've hit it now," Dennis cried excitedly. Another hound joined the procession, then another and another, and in 2 minutes the whole pack of 8 were in full cry. Again the hunter's deep voice rang his wild cheer through the woods, and every dog raised his answering cry a note higher. "Ain't that music?" Tom cried in ecstasy. They stood and listened. The dogs were still in the woods, and with each yelp they were coming nearer. Evidently the trail led toward them, but in the rear and almost toward the exact spot at which they had entered the forest. "Just listen at old Boney," the boy cried. "I can tell him now. He can beat 'em all." Loud and clear above the chorus of the others rang the long, savage boom of the Boney's voice, quivering with passion, defiant, daring, sure of victory. It came at regular intervals, as if to measure the miles that separated him from the battle he smelled afar. He was far in the lead. He was past master of the sport. The others were not even in his class. The boy's heart swelled with pride. "Old Boney's showing 'em all the way," he exclaimed triumphantly. "Yer can bet he always does that, sonny," the father answered. "That's a hot trail. Now, as I can figure, we're going to have some fun. There's more'n one coon traveling over that ground." "How can you tell?" Dennis asked incredulously. "It's too easy for the other pups. They'd lose scent now and then if they weren't but one. They ain't lost it a minute since they struck it. Lord, just listen." He paused and held his breath. "Did you ever hear anything like it on the earth?" Dennis cried. Every dog was opening now at the top of his voice. At regular intervals, the swing and leap of their bodies over the brush and around the trees registering in each stirring note. Again Tom gave a shout of approval. The sound of the leader's voice suddenly flattened and faded. "By gum," the old hunter cried, "they've left the woods, struck that field, and made for the creek. You won't need that axe tonight, Dennis." "Why?" "Wait and see," was the short answer. They hurried from the woods, and had scarcely reached the edge of the field when suddenly old Boney's cries stopped short, and in a moment the others were silent. "Good Lord, they've done lost it." And then came the quick, sharp, fierce bark of the leader announcing that the quarry had been located. Tom gave a yell of triumph and started on a run for the spot. "Up one of them big sycamores in the edge of that water, I'll bet," Dennis wailed. "You'll need no axe," was the older man's short comment. They pushed their way rapidly through the cane to the banks of the creek and found the dogs scratching with might and main straight down into the sand about 10 feet from the water's edge. "Well, I'll be doggone," Dennis cried. "If I ever seed anything like that afore. They've gone plumb crazy. There ain't no hole here. A coon can't just drap into the ground without a hole." The old hunter laughed. "No, but a coon might learn something from a beaver now and then, and locate the door to his house under the water line and climb up here to find a safe place, couldn't he?" "I don't believe it," Dennis sneered. "You have to go to the house and get a spade," Tom said finally. "It'll take one to dig a hole big enough to ever persuade one of them dogs to put his nose down that den. It ain't more'n a mile to the house. Hurry back." Dennis started on a run. "Don't you let him get out and start that fight afore I get here," he called. "You'll see it all," Tom reassured him. He made the dogs stop scratching and lie down to rest. "Just save your strength, boys," Tom cried. "You'll need it presently." They sat down. The father lit his pipe and told the boy the story of a great fight he had witnessed on such a creek bank once before in his life. Day was dawning and the eastern sky reddening. The boys stamped on the solid ground and couldn't believe it was possible that any dog could smell game through 6 feet of earth. He lifted Boney's long nose and looked at it curiously. His wonderful nostrils were widened, distended, and though he laid quite still on the sand on the edge of the hole, his muscles were quivering with excitement, and his wistful hound eyes had in them now the red glare of the coming battle. It was quick work when Dennis arrived to throw the sand and soft earth away and open a hole 5 feet in depth and of a sufficient width to allow the dogs to get a foothold inside. Suddenly the spade crashed through an opening below, and the rasp of sharp, desperate teeth and claws rang against its polished surface. "Did you ever hear that?" Tom laughed. Another spadeful out, and they could be plainly seen. How many it was impossible to tell, but 3 pairs of glowing, bloodshot eyes in the shadows showed plainly. As Tom straightened his massive figure and gave a shout to the dogs, they all danced around the upper rim of the hole and barked with fierce, boastful yelps. But none would venture his nose within 2 feet of them grim, shining eyes. "Well, Dennis," Tom sighed, "I reckon I'll have ter shovel you down thar and hold ye by the heels while yer pull out one of 'em." "I'll be doggone if yer do," he remarked with emphasis. Tom laughed. "You was afeard you wouldn't get here in time, you know." "Oh, I'm in time, all right." The hunter put his hands in his pockets and gazed at the warriors below. "Well, we'll try to get a dog to yank one of them out, and then they'll all come. But I have my doubts. I don't believe that God Almighty ever yet built a dog that'll stick his nose in that hole. It takes 3 dogs to kill one coon in a fair fight. Old Boney's the only pup I ever seen do it by himself, but it's asking too much of him to stick his nose down a place like that with 3 of 'em looking right at him ready to tear his eyes out. But they ain't nothing like trying." He paused and looked at the old warrior of 100 bloody fields, pointed at the bottom of the hole, and a stern command shouted, "Fetch 'em out, Bone." With a deep growl, the faithful old soldier sprang to the front with teeth shining and white gleaming rows. He scrambled within a foot of the opening of the den, circled it twice, his eyes fixed on the flashing light below. They followed his every move. He tried the stratagem of right and left flank movements, but the space was too narrow. He dashed straight toward the opening, once with a loud angry cry, hoping to get the flash of a coward's back. He met 3 double rows of white needle-like teeth, daring him to come on. He squatted flat in his belly and growled with desperate fury, but he wouldn't go closer. The hunter urged in vain. "It's no use," he cried at last. "Just as well ax ter dog to walk in a den or lions. I don't blame him." The boy's pride was hurt. "I can make him bring one out," he said. Tom shook his head. "Not much, less you see." The boy stepped down to the dog's side. "Look out, you fool. Don't let your foot slip in thar," his father warned. The boy knelt beside the dog, patted his back, and began to talk to him in low, tense tones. "Fetch 'em out, Bone. Go after 'em. Sick 'em, boy. Sick 'em." Closer and closer the brave old fighter edged his way, only a low, mad growl answering to the boy's urging. His eyes were blazing now, and the red rays of the rising sun was like 2 balls of fire. With a sudden savage plunge, he hurled himself into the den, and as quick as a flash of lightning, his short, hairy neck gave a flirt, and a coon as large as one of the hounds whizzed 10 feet into the air, and with his white teeth shining, struck the ground, lighting squarely on his feet. A hound dashed for him, and one slap from the long, sharp claws sent him howling and bleeding into the canes. But old Boney had watched him in the air, and circling the pack that faced the coon with a quick leap, had downed him. Then every dog was with him, and the battle was on. 8 dogs to 1 coon, and yet so sharp were his claws, so keen the steel-like points of his teeth. He sometimes had 4 dogs rolling in agony beside the growling mass of fur and teeth and nails. The fight had scarcely begun when one of the remaining coons leaped out of the den. Tom's watchful eye had seen him. He pulled 3 dogs from the first battle group and hurled them on the new fighter. He had scarcely started this struggle when the third sprang from the top of the earthen breastwork, surveyed the field, and with sullen deliberation trotted to the water's edge, jumped in, and placing 2 paws on a swaying limb, dared any dog to come. Here was work for the veteran. Boney was the only dog in the pack who would dare accept that challenge. Tom choked him off the first coon, pulled him to the bank, and showed him his enemy in the water. He looked just a moment at the snarling, daring mouth and made the plunge. The boy had followed the dog and watched with bated breath. He circled the coon twice, swimming in swift, graceful curves, but his enemy was too shrewd. A flank movement was impossible. The coon's fierce mouth was squarely facing him at every turn, and the dog plunged straight on his foe. To his horror, the boy saw the fangs sink into his friend's head. 4 set of sharp claws circled his neck, a tense gray ball of fur hanging its dead weight below. The water ran red for a moment as both slowly sank to the bottom. Eyes wide with anguish, he heard his father's cry, "By the Lord, he'll kill that dog sure. He's a goner." "No, he won't neither," the boy shouted, leaping into the water when he saw them go down. Before his father could warn him of the danger, his head disappeared in the deep, still eddy. "Look out for us, Dennis," with a pole. "I'm going to dive for him." In the moment they came to the surface, the man holding the boy grasping his dog, the coon fastened to the dog's head. "Well, don't that beat the devil?" Tom laughed as he carried them to a little rocky island in the middle of the creek. The boy, intent on saving his dog, had held his breath and was not even strangled. The dog had buried his nose into the coon's throat and was chewing and choking with savage determination. Tom stood over them now on the little island, with its smooth, stone-paved battle arena, ringed with the music of laughing waters. He threw both hands above his shaggy head and yelled himself hoarse, the wild cry of the hunter's soul in delirious joy. "Yeah! Yeah!" A moment's pause, and then the low snarl and growl and clash of tooth and claw. Again the hunter's gnarled hands flew over his head. "Yeah! Yeah! Yeah! Yeah!" On the shore, Dennis stood first over one group of swirling, rolling, snarling brutes, and then over the other, yelling and cheering. The coon on the island suddenly broke his assailant's death-like grip, and with a quick leap reached the water. Boney was on him in a moment, and down they went, beneath the surface again. The boy sprung to the rescue. His father brushed him roughly aside. "Keep out. I'll get him." 3 times the coon made the dash for the deep water, and 3 times Tom carried both dog and coon back to the little island, yelling his battle cry anew. The smooth stones began to show red. Fur and dog hair flew in little tufts and struck the ground, sometimes with the flat splash of red flesh. The boy frowned and his lips quivered. At last he could hold it in no longer. Through chattering teeth he moaned, "He'll kill Boney, Pa." "Let him alone," was a sharp command. "I never seen such a dog in my life. He'll kill that coon by himself, I'll tell you." Again his enemy broke Boney's grim hold on his throat, sprang back 4 feet, and to the dog's surprise made no effort to reach the water. Instead he stood straight and quivering on his hind legs and faced his enemy, his white needle-like fangs gleaming in 2 rows and his savage foreclaws opening and closing with deadly threat. The old warrior, taken completely by surprise by this new stratagem of his foe, circled in a vain effort to reach the flank or rear. Each turn only brought them again face to face, and at last he plunged straight on the center line of attack. With a quick side leap, the coon struck the dog's head a blow with his claw that split his ear for 3 inches, as cleanly and evenly as if a surgeon's knife had been used. With a low growl of rage and pain, Boney wheeled and repeated his assault, with the same results for the other ear. He turned in silence and deliberately crept toward his foe. There would be no chance for a side blow. He wouldn't plunge or spring. He might get another bloody gash, but he wouldn't miss again. This time he found the body. They closed and rolled over and over in close, blood-stained grip. For the first time, Tom's face showed doubts as he called to Dennis. "Choke off 2 dogs from that first coon and throw 'em in here." They came in a moment and clinched with Boney's enemy. The charge of the 2 new troopers drove the coon to desperation. The sharp claws flew like lightning. The new dog ran back into the water with howls of pain and scrambled up the bank to their old job. Boney paid no attention either to the unexpected assault of his friends or their ignoble desertion. Every ounce of his dog manhood was up now. It was a battle to the death, and he had no wish to live if he couldn't whip any coon that could ever make a track on his path. The boy's pride was roused now, and the fighting instinct that slumbers in every human soul flashed through his excited eyes. He drew near and watched with increasing excitement and joined with his father at last in shouts and cheers. "Did you ever see such a dog?" he cried through his tears. "He beats creation," was the admiring answer. The boy bent low over the squirming pair, and his voice was in perfect tune with his dog's low growl. "Eat him up, Bone. Eat him alive. Don't touch him," Tom warned. "Let him have a fair fight. If he don't kill that coon, I'll eat him raw, hide and hair." Boney had succeeded at last in fastening his teeth in a firm grip on the coon's throat. He held it without a cry of pain while the claws ripped his ears and gashed his head. Deeper and deeper sank his teeth until at last the razor claws that were cutting relaxed slowly and the long lean body with its beautiful fur lay full length on the red-marked stones. The dog loosened his hold instantly. His work was done. He scorned to strike a fallen foe. He started to the water's edge to quench his thirst and staggered in a circle. The blood had blinded him. The boy sprang to his side, lifted him tenderly in his arms, carried him to the water and bathed his eyes and head. "He's cut all to pieces," he sobbed at last. "He'll die, I just know it." "Nah," Father answered. "Be all right in about 2 or 3 days." The boy went back and looked at the slim body of the dead coon with wonder. "Why did this one fight so much harder than the ones on the bank?" he asked thoughtfully. "'Cause she's their mother," Tom said casually, "and them's her 2 children." Something hurt deep down in the boy's soul as he looked at the graceful nose and red-stained fur at her throat. He saw his mother's straight neck and head outlined again. Against the starlit sky the night she stood before him, rifle in hand, and shot at that midnight prowler. His mouth closed firmly, and he spoke with bitter decision. "I don't like coon hunting. I'm not coming any more." "Good Lord, boy, we've got to have skins, ain't we?" was the hearty answer. "I reckon so," he sorrowfully admitted. But all the way home he walked in brooding silence. 10. The following winter brought the event for which the mother had planned, and about which she had dreamed since her boy was born, the school. The men gathered on the appointed day, cut the logs, and split the boards for the house. Another day, and it was raised, and the roof was in place. Tom volunteered to make the teacher's table and chair and benches for the scholars. He had the best set of tools in the county, and he wished to do it because he knew it would please his wife. There was no money in it. But his life was swiftly passing in that sort of work. He was too big-hearted and generous to complain. Besides, the world in which he lived, the world of field and wood, of dog and gun, of game and the open road, was too beautiful and interesting to complain about it. He was glad to be alive and tried to make his neighbors think as he did about it. When the great day dawned, the young mother eagerly prepared breakfast for her children. She wouldn't allow Sarah to help this morning. It must be a perfect day in her life. She washed the boy's face and hands with scrupulous care. When the breakfast things were cleared away and her gray eyes were shining with joy he had never seen before, he caught her excitement, and the spirit of it took possession of his imagination. "What'll school be like, Ma?" he asked in a tense whisper. "Oh, This one won't be very exciting, maybe, in a little room built of logs, but it's the beginning, boy, of greater things. Just spelling, reading, writing, and arithmetic now, but you're starting on the way that leads out of these silent, lonely woods into the big world where great men fight and make history. Your father has never known this way. He's good and kind and gentle and generous, but he's just a child because he don't know. You're going to be a man among men for your mother's sake, aren't you? She seized his arms and gripped them in her eagerness until he felt the pain. Won't you, boy? She repeated tensely. He looked up steadily and then slowly said, Yes, I will. She clasped him impulsively in her arms and hurried from the cabin, leading the children by the hand. The boy could feel her slender fingers trembling. When they drew near the crossroads where the little log house had been built, she stopped nervously, fixed their clothes, took off the boy's cap, and brushed his thick black hair. They were the first to arrive, but in a few minutes others came, and by 9 o'clock more than 30 scholars were in their seats. The mother's heart sank within her when she met the teacher and heard him talk. It was only too evident that he was poorly equipped for his work. He could barely read and could neither write nor teach arithmetic. The only qualification about which there was absolute certainty was that he could lick the biggest boy in the school whenever the occasion demanded it. He conveyed this interesting bit of information to the assemblage in no uncertain language. The mother could scarcely keep back her tears. By the end of the week, it was plain that her children knew as much as the teacher. What's the use? Tom asked in disgust. It's a waste of time and money. Let him quit. No, I can't take him out, was the firm reply. They may not learn much, but if the school keeps going, don't you see a better man will come by and by, and then it will be worthwhile. Tom shook his head, but he let her have her own way. Besides, she went on, he'll learn something being with other children. Learn to fight, maybe. He did too, and the way it came about was as big a surprise to the boy as it was to the youngster he fought. The small bully of the school lived in the same direction as the boy and Sarah. They frequently walked together for a mile, going or coming, and grew to know another well. The boy disliked this towhead urchin from the moment they met. But he was quiet, unobtrusive, and modest, and genuinely allowed the loudmouthed one to have his way. The towhead took the boy's quiet ways for submission and insisted on patronizing his friend. The boy, good-natured, submitted when it cost him nothing of self-respect. At the close of school, the towhead whispered, Come by the spring with me. I want to show you something. No, I don't want to, he replied. Let Sarah go on and we'll catch her. I got a funny trick to show you. You'll kill yourself a-laughing. The boy's curiosity was aroused, and he consented. They hastened to the spring where the embers of a fire, at which the scholars were accustomed to warm their lunch, were still smoldering. The towhead one drew from the corner of the fence from a turtle, which he had captured and tied, scooped a red-hot coal from the fire with a piece of board, and placed it on the turtle's back. The poor creature, tortured by the burning coal, started in a scramble trying to run from the fire. The towhead roared with laughter. The boy, flushed with sudden rage, sprang forward and knocked the coal off. The two faced each other. You do that again and I'll knock you down, shouted the bully. You do it again and I'll knock you down, was the sturdy answer. You will you? The towhead cried with scorn. Well, I'll show you. With a bound he replaced the coal. The boy knocked it off and pounced on him. The fight was brief. They had scarcely touched the ground before the boy was on top, pounding with both his little fists. Stop it, you're killing me, the younger one screamed. Will you let him alone? The boy hissed. You're killing me, I tell you, the towhead yelled in terror. Stop it, I say. Would you kill a feller just for a doggone old cooter? Will you let him alone? Yes, if you won't kill me. The boy slowly rose. The towhead leaped to his feet, and with a look of terror started on a run. You need run, I won't hit you again, the boy cried. But the legs only moved faster. Never since he was born did the boy see a pair of legs get over the ground like that. He sat down and laughed and then hurried on to join Sarah. He didn't tell his sister what had happened. His mother mustn't know that he had been in a fight. But when he felt the touch of her hand on his forehead that night as he rose from her knee, he couldn't bear the thought of deceiving her again, so he confessed. It wasn't wrong, was it, to fight for a thing like that? He asked wistfully. No, came the answer. He needed a thrashing, the little scoundrel, and I'm glad you did it. 11. The school flickered out in 5 weeks, and the following summer another lasted for 6 weeks. And then they moved to the land that Tom had staked off in the heart of the great forest, 15 miles from the northern bank of the Ohio. He would still be in the side of the soil of Kentucky. The boy's heart beat with a new wonder as they slowly floated across the broad surface of the river. He could conceive of no greater one. There is a bigger one, his father said. The Mississippi's the daddy of all of 'em. The Ohio's lost when it rolls into her banks, stretching for 1,000 miles more, from the mountains in the north way down to the Gulf of Mexico and New Orleans. And it's all ours? He asked in wonder. Yes, and plenty more big uns to pour into it from the west. The boy saw again the impassioned face of the orator telling the glories of his country, and his heart swelled with pride. They left the river and plunged into the trackless forest. No roads had yet scarred its virgin soil, only the blazed trail for the first 10 miles, the trail that Tom had marked with his own hatchet, and then the magnificent woods without a mark. 5 miles further, they penetrated, cutting down the brush and trees to make way for the wagon. They stopped at last on a beautiful, densely wooded hill near a stream of limpid water. A rough camp was quickly built Indian fashion and covered with bear skins. The next day the father put into the boy's hand the new axe he had bought for him. You're not quite 8 years old, boy, he said encouragingly, but you're as big as a 12-year-old, and you're spunky. Do you think you can swing an axe that's a man's size? Yes, was his sturdy answer, and from that day he did it, with a song on his lips, no matter how heavy the heart that beat in his little breast. At first they cut the small poles and built a half-faced camp, and made it strong enough to stand the storms of winter, in case the cabin could not be finished before spring. The half-faced camp was made of small logs built on 3 sides, with the 4th open to the south. In front of this opening, the log fire was built, and its flame never died, day or night. To the soul of the boy, this half-faced camp, with its blazing logs in the shadow of the giant trees, was the most wonderful dwelling he'd ever seen. The stars that twinkled in the sky beyond the lacing boughs were set in his ceiling. No king in his palace could ask for more. But into the young mother's heart slowly crept the first shadows of a nameless dread. 15 miles from a human habitation in the depths of an unmarked wilderness, with only a hunter's camp for her home, and she had dreamt of schools. To her children, her face always gave good cheer, but at night she lay awake for long, pitiful hours, watching the stars and fighting the battle alone with despair. Yet there was never a thought of surrender. God lived, and her faith was in him. The same stars were shining above that sparkled in old Virginia and Kentucky. Something within sang for joy at the sight of her boy, strong of limb and dauntless of soul. He was God's answer to her cry, and always she went the even tenor of her ways, singing softly that he might hear. His father set him to the task of clearing the first acre of ground for the crop next spring. It seemed a joke to send a child with an axe into that huge forest and tell him to clear the way for civilization, and yet he went with firm, eager steps. He chose the biggest tree in sight for his first task, a giant oak tree, 3 feet in diameter, its straight trunk rising 100 feet without limb or knot to mar its perfect beauty. The boy leaped on the fallen monarch of the woods with a new sense of power. Far above gleamed a tiny space in the sky. His hand had made it. He was a force to be reckoned with now. He was doing things that counted in a man's world. Day after day his axe rang in the woods until a big white patch of sky showed with gleaming piles of clouds, and shimmering sunbeams were warming the earth for the seed of the coming spring. His tall, thin body ached with mortal weariness, but the spirit within was too proud to whine or complain. He had taken a man's place. His mother needed him, and he'd play the part. The winter was the hardest and busiest he had ever known. He shot his first wild turkey from the door of their log camp the second week after arrival, proud of his marksmanship. He talked of it for a week, and yet he didn't make a good hunter. He allowed his father to go alone oftener than he would accompany him. There was a queer little voice somewhere within that protested against the killing. He wouldn't acknowledge it to himself, but half the joy of his shot at his turkey was destroyed by the sight of the blood-stained broken wing when he picked it up. The mother watched this trait with deepening pride. His practice at writing and reading was sheer joy now. Her interest was so keen that he always tried his best that he might see her smile. It was time to begin the spring planting before the heavy logs were rolled and burned and the smaller ones made ready for the cabin. The corn couldn't wait. The cabin must remain unfinished until the crop was laid by. It had been a long, lonely winter for the mother, but with the coming of spring, the wooded world was clothed in beauty so fresh and marvelous, she forgot the loneliness in new hopes and joys. Settlers were moving in now. Every week Tom brought the news of another neighbor. Her aunt came in midsummer, bringing Dennis and his dogs with fun and companionship for the boy. The new cabin was not quite finished, but they moved in and gave their kin their old camp for a home, already without the stroke of an axe. Dennis was wild over the hunting and proposed to the boy a deer hunt all by themselves. "Let's just you and me go, boy, and show Tom what we can do with a rifle without him. You can take the first shot with old Speakeasy, and then I'll try her. The deer'll be thick as bees around that salt lick now." The boy consented. Boney went with him for company. As a self-respecting coon dog, he scorned to hunt any animal that couldn't fight with an even chance for his life. As for a deer, he'd his life chase a calf. Dennis placed the boy at a choice stand behind a steep hill, in which the deer would be sure to plunge in their final rush to escape the dogs when close pressed in the valley. "Now the minute you'll see him jump that ridge, let him have it," Dennis said. "He'll come straight down that hill, right into your face." The boy took his place and began to feel the savage excitement of his older companion. He threw the gun in place and drew a bead on an imaginary bounding deer. "All right, I'll crack him," he promised. "Now, for the Lord's sake, don't you miss him," Dennis warned. "I don't want Tom to have the laugh on us." The boy promised, and Dennis called his dogs and hurried into the bottoms toward the salt lick. In half an hour the dogs opened on a hot trail that grew fainter and fainter in the distance until they could scarcely be heard. They stopped altogether for a moment and then took up the cry, gradually growing clearer and clearer. The deer had run the limit of his first impulse and taken the back track, returning directly over the same trail. Nearer and nearer the pack drew, the trail growing hotter and hotter with each leap of the hounds. The boy was trembling with excitement. He cocked his gun and stood ready. Boney lay on a pile of leaves 10 feet away, quietly dozing. Louder and louder ran the cry of the hounds. They seemed to be right back of the hill now. The deer should leap over its crest at any moment. His gun was half lifted and his eyes flaming with excitement when a beautiful, half-grown fawn sprang over the hill and stood for a moment staring with wide, startled eyes straight into his. The savage yelp of the hounds close behind rang clear, sharp, and piercing as they neared the summit. The panting, trembling fawn glanced despairingly behind, looking again into the boy's eyes. And as the first dog leaped the hill crest, made his choice, staggering and panting with terror, he dropped on his knees by the boy's side, the bloodshot eyes begging piteously for help. The boy dropped his gun and gathered the trembling thing in his arms. In a moment the hounds were on him, leaping and tearing at the fawn. He kicked them right and left and yelled with all his might, "Down, I tell you! Down or I'll kill you!" The hounds continued to leap and snap in spite of his kicks and cries until Boney saw the struggle and stepped between his master and his tormentors. One low growl and not another hound came near. When Dennis arrived, panting for breath, he couldn't believe his eyes. The boy was holding the exhausted fawn in his laps with a glazed look in his eyes. "Well, of all the damn fool things I've ever seen since God made me, this takes a cake," he cried in disgust. "Why didn't you shoot him?" "Because he ran to me for help. How could I shoot him?" Dennis sat down and roared, "Well, of all the deer hunting, this beats me." The boy rose, still holding the fawn in his arms. "You can take the gun and go on. Boney and me'll go back home." "You ain't going to carry that thing clean home, are you?" "Yes, I am. And I'll kill any dog that tries to hurt him." Dennis was still laughing when he disappeared, Boney walking slowly at his heels. He showed the fawn to his mother and told Sarah she could have him for a pet. The mother watched him with shining eyes while he built a pen and then lifted the still trembling wild thing inside. Next morning the pen was down and the captive gone. The boy didn't seem much surprised or appear to care. When he was alone with his mother, she whispered, "Didn't you go out there last night and let it loose when the hounds were asleep?" He was still a moment, then nodded his head. His mother clasped him to her heart. "Oh, my boy, my own, I love you." 12. The second winter in the wilderness was not so hard. The heavy work of clearing the timber for the cornfields was done, and the new cabin and its furniture had been finished, except for the door, for which there was little use. The new neighbors brought cheer to the mother's heart. An early spring broke the winter of 1818 and clothed the wilderness world in robes of matchless beauty. The boys' gourds were placed beside the new garden, and the noise of chattering martins echoed over the cabin. The toughened muscles of his strong, slim body no longer ached in rebellion at his tasks. Work had become part of the rhythm of life. He could sing at his hardest task. The freedom and strength of the woods had gotten into his blood. In this world of waving trees, of birds and beasts, of laughing sky and rippling waters, there were no masters, no slaves. Millions in gold were of no value in its elemental struggle. Character, skill, strength, and manhood only counted. Poverty was teaching him the first great lesson of human life, that man shall eat his bread by the sweat of his brow, and that industry is the only foundation on which the moral and material universe has ever rested or can rest. Solitude and the stimulus of his mother's mind were slowly teaching him to think deeply and fearlessly, and to think for himself. Entering now into his 9th year, he was shy, reticent, overgrown, consciously awkward, homely and ill-clad. He grew so rapidly that it was impossible to make his clothes fit. But in the depths of his hazel gray eyes, there were slumbering fires that set him apart from the boys of his age. His mother saw and understood. A child in years, and yet he had already learned the secrets of the toil necessary to meet the needs of life. He swung a woodman's axe with any man. He could plow and plant a field, make its crop, harvest and store its fruit, and cook 'em for the table. He could run, jump, wrestle, swim, and fight when manhood called. He knew the language of the winds and clouds, and spoke the tongues of woods and field. And he could read and write. His mother's passionate yearning and quenchless enthusiasm had placed in his hand the key to books, and the secrets of the ages were his for the asking. He would never see the walls of a college, but he had already taken his degree in industry, patience, caution, courage, pity, and gentleness. The beauty and glory of this remarkable spring brought him into still closer communion with his mother's spirit. They had read every story of the Bible, some of them twice or three times, and his stubborn mind had fought with her many a friendly battle over their teachings. Always too wise and patient to command his faith, she waited its growth in the fullness of time. He had read every tale in Aesop's fables and brought 1,000 smiles to his mother's dark face by his quaint comments. She was dreaming now of new books to place in his eager hands. Corn was 10 cents a bushel, wheat 25, and a cow was only worth $6. Whiskey, hams, and tobacco were legal tender and used instead of money. She had ceased to dream of wealth and goods and chattel until conditions were changed. Her one aim in life was to train the minds of her children, and to this joyous task she gave her soul and body. It was the only thing worthwhile. That God would give her strength for this was all she asked, and then the great shadow fell. The mother and children were walking home from the woods through the glory of the southern spring morning in awed silence. The path was hedged with violets and buttercups. The sweet odor of the grapevine, blackberry, and dewberry blossoms filled the air. Dogwood and black haw lit with white flame the furthest shadows of the forest, and the music of birds seemed part of the mingled perfume of flowers. The boy's keen ear caught the drone of bees, and his sharp eye watched them climb slowly toward their storehouse in a towering tree. All nature was laughing in the madness of joy. The boy silently took his mother's hand and asked in subdued tones, "What's a pest, Ma, and what makes it?" "Nobody knows," she answered softly. "Comes like a thief in the night and stays for months, sometimes for years. They call it the milk sick, because the old cows die, and sometimes the horses. The old Indian women say it starts from the cows eating a poison flower in the woods. The doctors know nothing about it. It just comes and kills, it's all." The little hand suddenly gripped hers with trembling hold. "Oh, Ma, if it kills you." A tender smile lighted her dark face as the warmth of his love ran like a fire through her veins. "It can't harm me, my son, unless God wills it. When he calls, I shall be ready." All the way home he clung to her hand, and sometimes when they paused, stroked it tenderly with both his. "What's it like?" he asked at last. "Can't you take bitters for it in time to stop it? How do you know when it's come?" "You begin to feel drowsy. A whitish coating is on the tongue, a burning in the stomach. The feet and legs get cold. You're restless, and the pulse grows weak." "How long does it last?" "Sometimes it kills in 3 days, sometimes 2 weeks. Sometimes it's chronic and hangs on for years and then kills." Every morning through the long black summer of the scourge, he asked her with wistful tenderness if she were well. Her cheerful answers at last brought peace to his anxious heart, and he gradually ceased to fear. She was too sweet and loving, and God too good that she should die. Besides, both his father and mother had given him a lesson in quiet, simple heroism that steadied his nerves. He looked at the rugged figure of his father, a new sense of admiration. He was no more afraid of death than of life. He was giving himself without question in an utterly unselfish devotion to the stricken community. There were no doctors within 30 miles, and if one came, he could but shake his head and advise simple remedies that did no good. Only careful nursing counted for anything. Without money, without price, without a murmur, the father gave his life to this work. No neighbor within 5 miles was stricken that he did not find a place by that bedside in fearless, loving, unselfish service. And when death came, this simple friend went for his tools, cut down a tree, ripped the boards from its trunk, made the coffin, and with tender reverence dug a grave and lowered the loved one. He was doctor, nurse, coffin maker, grave digger, comforter, and priest. His reverent lips had long known the language of prayer. With tireless zeal, The mother joined in this ministry of love, and the boy saw her slender figure walk so often beside trembling feet as they entered the valley of the great shadow that he grew to believe that she led a charmed life. Nor did he fear when Dennis came one morning and in choking tones said that both his uncle and aunt were stricken in the little half-faced camp but a few hundred yards away. He was sorry for Dennis. He had never known father or mother, only this uncle and aunt. "Don't you worry, Dennis," the boy said tenderly. "You'll live with us if they die." They both died within a few days. The night after the last burial, Dennis crawled into the loft with the boy to be his companion for many a year. And then the blow fell, swift, terrible, and utterly unexpected. He had long ago made up his mind that God had flung about his mother's form the spell of his almighty power, and the pestilence that walked into the night dared not draw near. An angel with flaming sword stood beside their cabin door. Last night in the soft moonlight a whippoorwill was singing nearby, and he fancied he saw the white-winged sentinel and laughed for joy. When he climbed down from his loft the next morning, his mother was in bed, and Sarah was alone over the fire cooking breakfast. His heart stood still. He walked with unsteady step to her bedside and whispered, "Are you sick, Ma?" "Yes, dear, it has come." He grasped her hot, outstretched hand and fell on his knees in sobbing anguish. He knew now it was the angel of death he had seen. Death stood at the door with drawn sword, to slay, not to defend, but the boy resolved to fight. She should not give up. She should not die. He would fight for her with all the hosts of hell, and single-handed, if he must. He rose from his knees, still holding her hand, his first hopeless burst of despair over, his heart beating with desperate resolution. "You won't give up, will you, Ma?" he whispered. She smiled wanly, and he rushed with breathless intensity. "I'm not going to let you die. I won't. I'll tell you I won't. I'll fight this thing, and you've got to help me, won't you?" "I'm ready for God's will, my boy," she said simply. "I don't want you to say that. I want you to fight and never give up." "Why, you can't die, Ma. You just can't. You're my only teacher now. There ain't no schools here. How can I learn books without you to help me? Say you'll get well. Please say it for me. Please. Just say it." He paused and couldn't go on for a moment. "Say you'll try then, just for me. Please say it." "I'll try, boy," she said tenderly at last. He flew to the creek bank, and in 2 hours came home with an armful of fresh sarsaparilla roots. He made a cut and pounded them into a soft pulp and made a poultice. Sarah helped him put it in place. He made his mother drink the bitters every hour. He got stones ready and had them hot to wrap in clothes and put to her feet the moment they fell cold. He wouldn't take her word for it either. He kept slipping his little hand under the cover to feel. The mother smiled at his tender, eager touch. "Now, boy, I'm feeling comfortable. Will you do something for me?" "What is it?" he cried eagerly. She smiled again. "Read to me. I want to hear your voice." "All right. What?" "The Bible, of course." "What story?" "Not a story this time. The 23rd Psalm." The boy took the warm Bible from the shelf, sat down at the edge of the bed, opened and began in low tones to read. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." His voice choked and he stopped. "Oh, Ma, I just can't read that one now. Why? Why did he come to you if he's your shepherd? Why? He buried his face in his hands, and her slender fingers touched his hair. "He knows best, my son. Read on. The words are sweet to my soul from your lips." With an effort he opened the book again. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Again the voice choked into silence, and he closed the book. I can't read it. I'm afraid you're going to give up." "Oh, Ma, you won't, will you? Please say you won't." No, I won't give up, my boy," she said soothingly. "I'm just ready for anything he sends." "But I don't want you to say that," he broke in passionately. "You must fight. You mustn't be ready. You mustn't think about dying. I won't let you die, I tell you." She stroked his forehead with gentle touch. "I won't give up for your sake. It's a promise now," he cried. "Yes, it's a promise." "Then I'm going for a doctor right away." "You can't find him, boy," his father said. "It's 30 miles across the Ohio into Kentucky where he lives. And this sickness, he ain't at home. It's foolishness to go." "I'll find him," was the firm response. The father made no further protest. He helped him saddle the horse, buckled the stirrups to fit his little bare legs, and gave him as clear directions as he could. "The moon'll be shining all night, boy," were his last words. "You can cross the river before 8 o'clock. If you get lost the other side, axe your way from the first house you come to." The boy nodded, and when he had fixed his bare toes into the stirrups, he leaned low and whispered, "You won't give up, Pa, will you? You'll fight for it till I get back." The big gnarled fist closed over the little hand on the pommel of the saddle, and the father's voice was husky. "As long as there's breath in her body. Hurry now." The last command was not needed. The horse felt the quiver of tense suffering in the low voice, and the nervous touch of the switch on his side. With a quick bound, he was off at a full gallop, down the trail toward the river. The sun had set before they reached the open country beyond the great forest, but by 7 o'clock the boy saw the hilltop, the shining mirror of the river, and the calm moonlit valley. Before night, he had succeeded in rousing the ferryman and reached the opposite shore. He lost his way once, about 9 o'clock, and a settler whose light he saw in the woods called sharply from the door with rifle in hand. "Who are you?" "I'm just a little boy," the voice faltered. "Trying to find a doctor's house. My mom's about to die and I'm lost. I want you to show me the road." The rifle was lowered and the cabin stirred. The man dropped back and a woman appeared in the doorway. "Won't you come in, honey, and rest a minute, and me give you something to eat while Pa's getting ready to go with you a piece?" "No, I can't eat nothing." He didn't dare go near that tender voice that spoke so clearly, its sympathy in the night. He would be crying in a minute if he did, and he couldn't afford that. The settler caught a horse and rode with him an hour to make sure he wouldn't miss the way again. He reached the doctor's house by 11 o'clock, and to his joy found him at home. The rough old man refused to move an inch until he had fed his horse and eaten a hearty meal. The boy tried to eat but couldn't. The food stuck squarely in his throat. It was no use. He went outside and waited beside his horse until the doctor was ready. It seemed like an eternity, the awful wait. How serene the still beauty of the autumn night. Not a breath of wind stirred. The full moon hung in the sky straight overhead, flooding the earth with silver radiance, marking in clear and vivid lines the shadow of the trees on the ground. Bitter wonder and rebellion filled his young soul. How could God sit unmoved among those shining stars and leave his mother to die? The doctor came at last, and they started. In vain he urged that they gallop. "It won't do, sir," the old man snapped. "Your horse has come 30 miles. I'll not let you kill him, and I'm not going to kill myself plunging over a rough road at night." They reached the cabin at daylight. The boy saw the glow of the flame in the big fireplace through the woods, and his heart beat high with new hope. Now that the doctor was here, he felt sure a life could be saved. The boy stood close by his side when he felt her pulse and looked at the strange, whitish-brown coating on her tongue. "You can do something, doctor?" he asked anxiously. "Yes," was the short answer. He asked for a towel and bowl and opened his saddlebags. He examined the point of his lancet and bared the slender arm. "What are you going to do?" Tom asked with a frown. "Bleed her, of course. It's the only thing to do." The boy suddenly pushed himself between the doctor and the bed, looked up into his stern face with a resolute stare. "You shan't do it. I don't know nothing much about doctoring, but I got sense enough to know that'll kill her, and you shan't do it." The doctor looked angrily at the father. "I'll say so, too," Tom replied. "She's too weak for that." With a snort of anger, the old man threw the lancet into his saddlebags, snapped them together, and strode through the cabin door. The boy followed him wistfully to the stable. When he seized the bridle to put on the horse, caught his hand and looked up. "Please don't go," he begged. "I'm mighty sorry I made you mad. I didn't go to do it. You see," his voice faltered, "I love her so I just couldn't let you cut open her arm and see her bleed. I'd mean to hurt your feelings. Won't you stay and help us? Can't you do something else for her? I'll pay ye. I'll go to work for you a whole year, 5 years if you want me. If you just save her. Just save her, that's all. Don't go. Please don't go." Something in the child's anguish found the rough old man's heart. His eyes grew misty for a moment. He slipped one arm around the boy's shoulder and drew him close. "God knows I'd stay and do something if I could, Sonny. But I don't know what to do. I'm not sure I'm right about the bleeding, or I'd stay and make you help me do it. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And I can do no good by staying. Keep her warm. Give her all the good food her stomach will retain. That's all I can tell you. She's in God's hands." With a heavy heart, the boy watched him ride away as the sun rose over the eastern hills. The doctor's last words sank into his soul. She was in God's hands. Well, he would go to God and beg him to save her. He went into the woods, knelt beside a great oak, and in the simple words of a child asked for the desire of his heart. 3 times every day and every night he prayed. For 4 days no change was apparent. She was very weak and tired, but suffered no pain. His prayer was heard and would be answered. The first symptom of failure in circulation he promptly met by placing the hot stones to her feet, and for hours he and Sarah would rub her until the cold disappeared. On the morning of the 7th day she was unusually bright. "Why, you're better, Ma, aren't you?" he cried with joy. Her eyes were shining with a strange excitement. "Yeah, I'm better. I'm going to sit up a while. I'm tired lying down." She threw herself quickly on the side of the bed, and her feet touched the bearskin rug. She rose trembling and smiling and took a step. She tottered a bit, but the boy was laughing and holding her arm. She reached the chair by the fire, and he wrapped a great skin around her feet and limbs. "Look, Pa, she's getting well," the boy shouted. Tom watched her gravely without reply. She took the boy's hand, still smiling. "I had such a wonderful dream," she began slowly. "The same one I had before you were born, my boy. God had answered my prayer and sent me a son. I watched him grow to be a strong, brave, patient, wise, and gentle man. Thousands hung on his words, and the great from the ends of the earth came to do him homage. With uncovered heads, he led me into a beautiful home with white pillars. And then he bowed low and whispered in my ear, 'This is yours, my angel mother. I bought it for you with my life. All that I am I owe to you.'" Her voice sank to a whisper that was half a sob and half a laugh. "See how she's smiling, Pa?" the boy said. "She's getting well." "Don't you understand?" the father whispered. "Look at her eyes. She's not telling you a dream. She's looking through the white gates of heaven. It's death, boy. It's come. Lord God, have mercy." With a groan, he dropped by her side. Her thin hand rested gently on his shaggy head. The boy stared at her in agonizing wonder as she felt for his hand and feebly held it. She was gazing now into the depths of his soul with her pensive, hungry eyes. "Be good to your father, my son." She paused for breath and looked at him tenderly. She knew the father was the child of the future, the boy, the man. "Yes." He whispered, "Love your sister." "Yes." "Be a man among men for your mother's sake." "Yes, Ma, I will." The little head bent low and the voice was silent. They went to work to make her coffin at noon. An unused walnut log of burled fiber had been lying in the sun and drying for 2 years, since Tom had built the furniture for the cabin. Dennis helped him rip the boards from this dark, rich wood, shape it and plane it for the pieces he would need. The boy sat with dry eyes and aching heart, making the wooden nails to fasten these boards together. He stopped suddenly, walked to the bench at which his father was working, and laid by his side the first pins he had whittled. "I can't do it, Pa," he gasped. I just can't make the nails for her coffin. I feel like somebody's driving 'em through my heart." The rugged face was lighted with tenderness as he slowly answered, "Why, we must make it, boy. It's the last thing we can do to show our love for her, to make it all smooth and purty out of this fine dark wood. You wouldn't put her in the ground and throw the cold dirt right on her face, would you?" The slim figure shivered. No, I wouldn't do that. Yes, I'll help you. We must make it beautiful, mustn't we?" And then he went back to the pitiful task. They dug her grave, these loving hands, father and son, in an orphan waif, on a gentle hill in the deep woods. As the sun sank in a sea of scarlet clouds the next day, they lowered the coffin. The father lifted his voice in a simple prayer, and the boy took his sister's hand and led her in silence back to the lonely cabin. He couldn't stay to see them throw the dirt over her. He couldn't endure it. He had heard of ghosts in graveyards, and he wondered vaguely if such things could be true. He hoped it was. When the others were asleep just before day, he slipped noiselessly from his bed and made his way to her grave. The waning moon was shining in cold white splendor. The woods were silent. He watched and waited and hoped with half faith and half fear that he might see her radiant form rise from the dead. A leaf rustled behind him, and he turned with a thrill of awful joy. He wasn't afraid. He'd clasp her in his arms if he could. With a firm step and head erect, eyes wide and nostrils dilated, he walked straight into the shadows to see anew. And there, standing in a spot of pale moonlight, stood his dog, looking up into his eyes with patient, loving sympathy. He hadn't shed a tear since her death. Now the flood tide broke the barriers. He sank to the ground, slipped his arms around his dog's neck, and sobbed aloud. He wrote a tear-stained letter to the only person he knew. It was the first historic record, and he signed his name in bold, well-rounded letters, A. Lincoln. 3 months later, the faithful old man came in answer to his request and preached her funeral sermon. Something in the lad's wistful eyes that day fired him with eloquence. Through all his life, the words rang with strange, solemn power in the boy's heart. "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Blessed are they that die in the Lord. Death is not the chill shadow of night, but the gray light of dawn, the dawn of a new eternal. Lift up your eyes and see its beauty. Open your ears and hear the stir of its wondrous life." When the last friend had gone, the forlorn little figure stood beside the grave alone. There was a wistful smile on his lips as he slowly whispered, "I'll not forget, Ma, dear. I'll not forget. Yeah, I'll live for you." Nor did he forget. In her slender figure, a new force had appeared in human history. The peasant woman of the old world had taught her child contentment with his lot, and patient millions beyond the seas bend their backs without a murmur to the tasks their fathers bore 3,000 years ago. Free America has given the race a new peasant woman, born among the lowliest of her kind. She walks earth's ways with her feet in the dust, her head among the stars. This one died young in a cabin beside the deep woods, but not before her hand had kindled a fire of divine discontent in the soul of her only son that only God could extinguish. End of the prologue.